Dear listeners, welcome back to Warm Mysteries. I'm your host Henry, and I'm glad you're here. Wherever you're listening from across Asia, these cozy Miss Marple mysteries bring us together. Tonight's story was chosen by our community. Thank you for being part of this journey. Don't forget to subscribe and let me know where you're listening from. Now, pour your tea and let's begin. Chapter 1. The Garden Party. Easter Sunday had dawned with the peculiar brilliance of a spring morning in St. Mary Mead. The air carried the scent of blooming primroses, and the village green was alive with laughter and the gentle clatter of teacups. White lace tablecloths fluttered over picnic tables, while the villagers, resplendent in their Sunday best, mingled with an ease born of generations of familiarity. It was the sort of day Miss Marple herself often attended, not for the spectacle, nor for the gossip, but for the quiet observations it offered. People reveal themselves most subtly when they believe no one is watching, and that was where her true interest lay. Mrs. Violet Badger, the hostess of the annual Easter garden party, was particularly radiant that morning, her pale blue dress catching the sunlight as she floated between clusters of guests. Oh, how lovely to see everyone gathered. Do enjoy the tea and do not skimp on the simnel cake, she chirped, her voice bright but just a fraction sharp at the edges, as if underlying tensions lurked beneath her cheerfulness. The village had been unusually restless that spring. A succession of minor scandals, Mr. Crompton's curious disappearance of his prized tulips, and the sudden departure of the vicar's niece, had sparked whispers, but nothing that truly unsettled St. Mary Mead. That is, until today. Miss Marple, seated near the far hedge with a notebook tucked discreetly into her lap, observed the scene with her customary patience. She watched as the Reverend Peters, a slender man with a perpetual look of mild concern, fidgeted with his spectacles while attempting to engage in conversation with young Emily Barton, who, for her part, seemed more interested in arranging her hat than in theology. Nearby, the formidable Mrs. Wilmot, whose reputation for charity work was rivalled only by her sharp tongue, surveyed the proceedings as though inspecting a troop of misbehaving children. "I do hope this is a peaceful Easter," Miss Marple murmured to herself, though there was a hint of wry amusement in her tone. Peace in a village such as this was always temporary, and she, of all people, knew that beneath the polite laughter and cordial smiles lay rivalries, secrets, and long-buried resentments. The first hint of disruption arrived unceremoniously. A sudden scream sliced through the cheerful murmur of conversation, sending birds flapping into the air. Guests turned, startled, to see young Thomas Edgecombe standing rigidly near the azaleas, his face ashen. "It's Mrs. Badger!" he cried. She's on the ground!" Miss Marple was already moving before the crowd had fully reacted. A small, wiry woman, her steps light but purposeful, she navigated the throng effortlessly, arriving at Mrs. Badger's side. The hostess was indeed sprawled across the grass, her delicate frame unnaturally still. Around her, teacups and plates had toppled, the sugar spilling like pale sand over the clover. "Oh dear," murmured Miss Marple, kneeling to examine her without touching, her eyes flicking over the scene with calm precision. "Has anyone called the doctor?" Yes, someone replied, though their voice trembled. A small commotion began as the villagers murmured, some stepping back, others trying to offer assistance. From her vantage point, Miss Marple noted every detail. Mrs. Badger's hands lay loosely at her sides, her expression oddly serene, yet there was a peculiar tinge of violet around her lips. Nothing suggested struggle, no tear in her dress, and yet the stillness of her body spoke of something far more sinister than a fainting spell. The village doctor, Dr. Harrington, arrived with brisk efficiency, his medical bag swinging from his arm. He knelt beside Mrs. Badger, checked her pulse, listened to her breathing. After a tense minute, he straightened, shaking his head gravely. "I'm afraid she's gone," he announced, and a collective gasp swept through the party. Miss Marple, for all outward composure, felt a familiar thrill of curiosity. The village had been shocked before, yes, but never so dramatically, never with such a potent mixture of fear and disbelief. Her mind began to work, piecing together the first fragments of the puzzle. The police arrived not long after, led by Inspector Craddock, a capable officer whose brusque efficiency often contrasted sharply with Miss Marple's quiet intuition. Craddock immediately began questioning witnesses, taking statements in clipped tones, jotting notes that would later be filed away and forgotten. He seemed satisfied with appearances, an obvious suspect. Perhaps, but Miss Marple noticed the subtle cracks in his reasoning, the assumptions he made about human nature that often led him astray. Meanwhile, the villagers offered their own theories. "It must have been the new gardener," Mrs. Wilmot whispered to anyone who would listen, her eyes darting nervously toward the young man who had only recently arrived in St. Mary Mead. "I saw him near the hedges just before the incident." "Oh, nonsense," countered Mr. Crompton, his face flushed with indignation. "Violet had no enemies, so why would anyone do this?" "You'd be surprised, Mr. Crompton," murmured Miss Marple to herself, sipping her tea with a careful grace. "People are rarely what they seem." As the day wore on, a grim hush settled over the village green. The tables remained cluttered, the scent of spilled tea mingling with the faint fragrance of primroses. Miss Marple found a quiet bench under a magnolia tree and resumed her observations, noting how people reacted to grief, to fear, to suspicion. The children were curious, peeking around corners and whispering to one another. The adults were wary, their polite facades beginning to fray. It was in this quiet that Miss Marple first noticed a small, seemingly inconsequential detail, a torn fragment of lace caught on a branch near the azaleas. No one else appeared to see it, but Miss Marple's keen eyes registered the subtle anomaly immediately. It was slight, almost insignificant, yet she felt the pulse of a hidden truth beneath it, a truth that others would overlook or dismiss as trivial. And so, Easter Sunday, in St. Mary Mead, ended not with laughter, nor with the gentle closure of a community gathering, but with a cloud of tension and unease. A murder had occurred, shattering the rhythm of village life, and already the subtle undercurrents of human behaviour began to ripple outward. Miss Marple, ever composed, tucked her notebook into her handbag and rose to her feet. She would listen, she would watch, and she would wait. The village might think it understood the events of the day, but the truth as always was more cunning, more elusive, and entirely human. As she walked slowly toward the village square, Miss Marple mused that nothing in St. Mary Mead remained hidden for long, but only if one knew how to look. And look she would, with all the patience and insight that had made her a quiet force in the village, unnoticed yet unerringly effective. Somewhere within the gossip, the fear, and the whispered confessions of the villagers lay the key to solving this murder. Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself, a wry twist of her lips that was almost invisible. Patience, she reminded herself, was everything, and in St. Mary Mead, patience always revealed the truth. Chapter 2. The village reacts. The news of Mrs. Badger's death spread through St. Mary Mead like wildfire. By mid-afternoon, the village square was buzzing with murmurs, conjectures, and outright speculation. Even those who had not attended the Easter garden party felt compelled to weigh in, their opinions delivered with varying degrees of certainty. Miss Marple, of course, moved quietly among the villagers, her small frame and gentle manner rendering her almost invisible amid the swirl of emotions. She listened, she observed, and she made mental notes, cataloguing reactions as though they were pieces of a puzzle. Each flutter of a hand, each involuntary twitch of a mouth, each hesitant glance could reveal more than the most meticulously prepared testimony. Mrs. Wilmot was the first to make her public pronouncement. "It must be the gardener," she declared, her voice tinged with indignation, as though identifying a suspect was an exercise in moral duty. "He was seen near the azaleas before anyone else noticed anything. That cannot be a coincidence." Several villagers nodded gravely, though others exchanged sceptical glances. Mr. Crompton, still flushed from the morning's shock, muttered something about how Mrs. Badger had no enemies worth mentioning. Even he, though, could not mask the faint tremor in his voice as he spoke, and Miss Marple noted it with interest. "You're forgetting one thing," interjected Emily Barton, cheeks pink from the spring air and her nervous energy. "People talk, yes, but sometimes it's not obvious at all. Sometimes it's someone you'd never suspect." Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself. Emily's remark, naive though it seemed, carried a kernel of truth that she intended to remember. People rarely presented themselves in plain view. The truth hid in subtleties, in contradictions, in those fleeting moments when one's carefully constructed facade faltered. The vicar, Reverend Peters, arrived shortly afterward. his tall, thin frame cutting a solemn figure through the gathering crowd. He offered prayers for the deceased, his voice soothing, yet Miss Marple noticed a hint of unease in his eyes. Perhaps it was the shock of loss, or perhaps, she mused, it was something more personal, a hidden thread in the tapestry of village life. Among the more vocal onlookers was Mrs. Tilling, the baker's wife, who had been delivering hot cross buns to the garden party when news of the tragedy reached her. "I always thought something like this would happen eventually," she said, shaking her head. "There's so much envy in this village. Someone must have wanted her gone." "You think too darkly," murmured a passing young man, Thomas Edgecombe, still pale from the morning's chaos. Yet even he did not deny the possibility, only that he hoped it was unfounded. The police continued their preliminary investigation, collecting statements with brisk efficiency, though Miss Marple detected a subtle impatience in Inspector Craddock's manner. He wanted quick answers, an obvious suspect, and a neatly tied conclusion. But life, as Miss Marple knew well, seldom provided such simplicity. The nuances of human behaviour were rarely so accommodating. As the afternoon wore on, Miss Marple found herself drawn to quieter corners of the village, away from the gossiping throngs. She observed the reactions of those most closely involved with Mrs. Badger, the household staff, the family friends, the distant relatives who had come for Easter. Each carried a story, some openly expressed, some tightly concealed, and each had something to hide, however small. Miss Marple's attention, inevitably, turned to the household staff first. Mrs. Badger's maid, a nervous young woman named Clara, clutched her apron as she recounted the morning's events. I brought out the tea and everything seemed normal. She was smiling, and then she fell. I tried to stop her, but I couldn't. Her voice broke slightly and she glanced around as though hoping someone might confirm that it had been a tragic accident. Miss Marple noted the tremor in Clara's hands and the tension in her shoulders. Nothing about the scene suggested direct involvement in foul play, but the way Clara recounted the events carried a faint, subtle dissonance, the kind that only a trained observer might detect. It was not guilt, Miss Marple decided, but fear. And fear, in a village such as St. Mary Mead, often masked deeper truths. Then there was Mrs. Badger's cousin, Lillian Hawthorne, a woman of considerable elegance and composed speech, who had been staying at the Badger estate for the holiday. She approached Miss Marple quietly, eyes filled with polite sorrow. "Such a dreadful thing, Miss Marple," she murmured. "Who could have done this? It is beyond comprehension." Miss Marple nodded, allowing a moment of silence to settle before speaking. "People are rarely as incomprehensible as they appear, Mrs. Hawthorne. Often the motives are simple, even if the methods are hidden." Lillian's gaze flickered, a subtle tightening around her mouth that Miss Marple did not miss. She made a mental note. Not everyone displayed grief in the same way, and sometimes the mask of propriety concealed more than mere sorrow. Even the villagers themselves were not immune to suspicion. Mrs. Wilmot continued her relentless speculation, whispering to anyone who would listen about the gardener, while Mr. Crompton muttered under his breath about rivalries and unspoken grudges. The quiet tension between neighbours became almost tangible, as though the village itself were holding its breath, waiting for the next revelation. Through it all, Miss Marple's attention returned to the torn fragment of lace she had noticed earlier near the azaleas. Small as it was, it had lodged itself in her mind like a note in a melody that refused to resolve. She did not yet understand its significance, but instinct told her it would play a crucial part in unravelling the truth. By late afternoon, the scene had settled into a tense rhythm. The police continued their work, the villagers whispered their theories, and Miss Marple remained a quiet observer, noting discrepancies, contradictions, and subtle cues that would escape less attentive eyes. She thought, not for the first time, that a village was a curious ecosystem. Beneath its placid surface flowed currents of envy, resentment, and secrecy, all of which could erupt unexpectedly, with consequences both tragic and revealing. In her years of observation, she had learned that a crime rarely emerged in isolation. It was always entwined with human relationships, past grievances, and the quiet manipulations of everyday life. As the sun dipped low over St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows across the green, Miss Marple rose from her bench. She knew that the coming days would require patience, discretion, and careful attention. The villagers would talk, rumours would fly, and the surface truths would be distracting, but beneath it all, the real story awaited. And Miss Marple, with her keen eyes and subtle understanding of human nature, would be ready. Chapter 3. Early Investigation. The day after the Easter garden party dawned grey and misty over St. Mary Mead. The village seemed subdued, as though the cheerful resilience of spring had been subdued by the shadow of Mrs. Badger's death. Shopkeepers spoke in hushed tones, and even the children seemed quieter, sensing the unease that had settled over the streets. Miss Marple, as always, moved with her characteristic quietness, taking her usual morning walk through the village before most had begun their day. She observed the subtle shifts in behaviour, a baker lingering too long at his counter, a postman hesitating before delivering letters, neighbours casting furtive glances at one another. All these small, seemingly innocuous actions could hold meaning if one knew where to look. The investigation, officially led by Inspector Craddock, had commenced in earnest. Craddock, a man both efficient and impatient, was eager to find a culprit quickly. Already he had questioned the household staff, the relatives, and the gardener. Statements were being compared and recorded, yet Miss Marple noted the way he accepted explanations at face value. He was looking for a simple narrative, a tidy solution, whereas the truth, she suspected, would be far more intricate. Miss Marple herself chose a different approach. She began by visiting the household staff one by one, under the pretence of offering condolences. To Clara, the young maid who had been closest to Mrs. Badger, she said softly, "How are you managing, Clara? It must be difficult to witness such a sudden tragedy." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but Miss Marple detected the subtle stiffness in her posture, the tension in her voice. I don't know, Miss Marple," she admitted. "It was all so sudden. I keep thinking, maybe I could have done something." "People often feel that way after accidents," Miss Marple murmured, choosing her words with deliberate care. "But sometimes, what appears to be an accident is more complex than we first suppose." Clara flinched slightly as though Miss Marple's words hinted at an uncomfortable truth. Miss Marple made a mental note of the reaction. It was small, but significant. Not every tremor of emotion was guilt, but every tremor told a story. Meanwhile, Inspector Craddock focused on the more obvious suspects. The gardener, young Edward Finch, was questioned repeatedly. He insisted he had been tending to the north hedge, far from the azaleas where Mrs. Badger had collapsed. "I didn't even hear anything until Thomas screamed," he said, his voice steady but cautious. "I wouldn't hurt her, not for all the world." Miss Marple observed the gardener from a distance, noting his careful attention to truth in small matters, the subtle alignment of his hands and feet when speaking. He seemed sincere, yet she withheld judgment. Sincerity, after all, could be cultivated. Attention then shifted to Mrs. Badger's cousin, Lilian Hawthorne. Miss Marple visited her under the guise of offering her company in grief. Lilian's composure was impeccable, but there were cracks, a sudden hesitation in speech, a slight narrowing of her eyes when asked about her whereabouts that morning. "I was in the sitting room reading," she said. "I heard nothing unusual." Miss Marple nodded gently. "Reading can be absorbing," she said. "Yet sometimes even the quietest rooms can reveal surprising sounds. If one listens carefully." Lilian's lips pressed into a thin line, and her fingers tightened around her teacup. Miss Marple did not press further, but she stored the reaction in her mind. People's small involuntary responses often spoke louder than their words. As she wandered the village, Miss Marple noticed that gossip had begun to form a network of assumptions. Mrs. Wilmot, true to her nature, had taken it upon herself to interview anyone who would listen, convinced of the gardener's guilt. The local grocer, Mr. Pritchard, repeated what he had heard from Mrs. Wilmot to anyone who entered his shop, adding flourishes that made the story even more dramatic. "I saw him near the azaleas," he told an elderly customer, lowering his voice as though confessing a secret. And then everything went wrong. Miss Marple only smiled inwardly. Human nature, she reflected, was predictable in its ways of weaving narratives from fragments of truth, often disregarding the inconvenient pieces that did not fit. And those fragments, the small inconsistencies, were often where the real story lay. By mid-morning, Miss Marple had begun piecing together the social map of motives. Mrs. Badger, though outwardly amiable, had a reputation for subtly managing the affairs of the village, often exercising influence over charitable donations, household employments, and local committee decisions. The power she wielded quietly had created minor resentments, which, though unlikely to lead to murder, could colour the behaviour of those around her. For instance, the vicar, Reverend Peters, had been slightly embarrassed by a past disagreement over parish funds. Clara, the maid, may have felt overlooked or constrained. Even Lillian Hawthorne, though well-mannered and poised, might have harboured hidden jealousies or frustrations. Miss Marple did not rule anyone out. She catalogued every nuance carefully. Back at the Badger estate, Miss Marple examined the garden with deliberate attention, noting the fragment of lace she had discovered the previous day. The lace was fine, of delicate quality, clearly belonging to a dress of some refinement. Its position, draped lightly on a branch, suggested that it had been torn recently. The implications were small but telling. A struggle, a sudden movement, or a misplaced gesture. Such details were often invisible to the casual observer, but spoke volumes to one trained in the observation of human behaviour. She also considered the timing of the incident. Morning gatherings were often the most predictable moments of social activity. Who would have been where? Who had opportunity? Opportunity alone did not indicate guilt, but it was an important thread to follow when the fabric of the story began to reveal itself. That evening, as the village quieted and the sun set behind the gentle hills, Miss Marple sat by her window with her notebook open. She recorded impressions, contradictions, and subtle cues that would otherwise be forgotten. She did not yet have the full picture, but she had enough to begin asking the right questions, to probe the hidden interactions that might illuminate the truth. And she noted with characteristic patience that in St. Mary Mead, appearances were always deceptive. The outward calm of the village was a thin veneer, beneath which currents of fear, jealousy, and hidden rivalries flowed. The police may be content with an obvious solution, but Miss Marple knew that the true culprit often concealed themselves in plain sight, confident that no one would notice the small details that betrayed their hand. The first threads of her investigation were now forming. Each person she had spoken to, each glance observed, each fragment of lace, every subtle contradiction, all would eventually weave together into a tapestry that, when viewed as a whole, would reveal the murderer. But patience, as always, was paramount. Rushing would only unravel the delicate pattern. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, eyes thoughtful, lips pursed in gentle reflection. The village had already begun to speculate, to assign blame, and to rehearse confessions that were not yet due. Yet she knew that in St. Mary Mead, the human heart often revealed its secrets in the smallest gestures, the briefest hesitations, the quietest truths. And she intended to listen to each one. Tomorrow, she decided, she would begin visiting the more peripheral figures in the village, the ones whose stories had not yet been examined, whose connections to the household and its tensions were less obvious. There were patterns to follow, and hints that only the careful observer could discern. The mystery had barely begun. Miss Marple's mind, serene yet alert, already hummed with questions. Why that lace? Why that hesitation? Why that tremor of emotion? In due time, the answers would emerge, but for now she remained the quiet sentinel of the village's hidden truths, patient, perceptive, and entirely unseen. Chapter 4. First Suspects. By midweek, St. Mary Mead had begun to settle into an uneasy routine. Shops reopened, the post arrived with its usual punctuality, and the children returned to school, though whispers of Mrs. Badger's death lingered like a low hum beneath the everyday rhythm of village life. Yet the shadow of tragedy clung to the streets and gardens, making even familiar sights feel slightly alien. Inspector Craddock, convinced that a resolution was overdue, focused his attention firmly on Edward Finch, the new gardener. To the casual observer, Finch seemed the ideal suspect, a newcomer, unacquainted with the subtleties of village life, and present near the azaleas at the critical moment. Craddock questioned him repeatedly, seeking inconsistencies, pressing for details, yet Finch's calm and precise responses frustrated the inspector. "I was tending the north hedge all morning," Finch said patiently, his hands clasped behind his back. "I only heard a commotion when Thomas screamed. I did not see her fall, nor did I approach the azaleas before it happened." Craddock scribbled furiously in his notebook, but Miss Marple, observing from a quiet distance, noted the gardener's relaxed posture, the steady cadence of his speech, and the lack of hesitation in his account. A guilty person, she thought, would exhibit subtle signs of discomfort, micropauses, shifting eyes, or overemphasized gestures. Finch displayed none of these. Yet the villagers were not so restrained. Mrs. Wilmot in particular took it upon herself to spread her opinion widely. "It's the gardener," she told anyone who would listen, her voice low and urgent. "Mark my words, he has the opportunity, and we cannot ignore that." Her certainty was infectious. Several villagers, though less vocal, began to cast wary glances at Finch when he passed through the square. Miss Marple, however, paid close attention to those reactions as well. Fear, prejudice, and the desire to find a simple explanation could distort perception, and she made a mental note to distinguish between instinctive fear and evidence-based suspicion. Meanwhile, attention also fell upon Lillian Hawthorne. Though outwardly composed, she had been unusually insistent on appearing concerned, even volunteering details about her movements that seemed rehearsed. "I was in the sitting room reading," she repeated to Miss Marple when they spoke privately, her voice perfectly even. "I heard nothing, saw nothing." Miss Marple had already noticed subtle signs, the slight narrowing of her eyes, the faint tension in her hands. Lillian's story, while plausible, carried the hallmarks of someone consciously managing perception. Yet the evidence was not sufficient to accuse her. Rather, it warranted careful observation. Miss Marple decided to approach her indirectly, watching for unguarded reactions rather than overt admissions. In the meantime, village gossip proliferated like a vine. Mr. Crompton, in his own understated way, began speculating about past grievances between Mrs. Badger and various neighbours. The vicar, Reverend Peters, worried aloud about parish committee disputes and charitable allocations. Even the baker's wife, Mrs. Tilling, had her own theory involving a petty argument over garden produce. Each explanation, no matter how improbable, was offered with the same earnest conviction that made them difficult to dismiss outright. Miss Marple, listening and observing, catalogued each opinion. It was not that she dismissed the villagers' words. On the contrary, they were often the best windows into motive. But she understood the difference between what people wanted others to believe and what they themselves were trying to conceal. The truth, she knew, was often layered beneath the polite and the performative. The torn lace fragment, still in her possession, had become an object of particular scrutiny. Examining it closely, she noted the quality of the fabric, the pattern of the tear, and the faint traces of soil adhering to it. Whoever had worn it had likely moved hastily, perhaps in the garden, yet there were no signs of a violent struggle. It was a puzzle. How could such a minor detail connect to a sudden fatal incident? Miss Marple also began to consider opportunity. Who had been in proximity to Mrs. Badger at the time of her fall? The gardener, yes, but also Clara, the maid, Lillian, the cousin, and even the more peripheral villagers who may have wandered near the property under innocent pretences. Each individual had a combination of motive and opportunity, though the motives were subtle, often entwined with envy, social resentment, or quiet frustrations. Inspector Craddock, frustrated by the lack of tangible leads, sought to simplify the investigation. "Finch is our prime suspect," he told Miss Marple one afternoon, not unkindly, but with a tone that implied impatience. "The evidence points to him. We'll be able to close the case quickly if he confesses or if something solid comes up." Miss Marple inclined her head, politely non-committal. "Sometimes, Inspector, the obvious choice is not the correct one. People often hide their actions in plain sight, or in plain innocence where no one looks for them." Craddock merely frowned, unaccustomed to thinking beyond the immediate. Yet Miss Marple's quiet assurance was a reminder that appearances could deceive, and that patience, combined with observation, often revealed the truth long before direct evidence did. Over the next few days she began visiting the other villagers, ostensibly to offer comfort, but in reality to listen and observe. Mrs. Wilmot continued to insist on Finch's guilt, her certainty growing with each retelling. Mr. Crompton, ever polite but inwardly uneasy, offered vague memories of disagreements between Mrs. Badger and various acquaintances, none of which seemed decisive. Clara the maid remained nervous, her movements small and constrained, as though constantly aware of being watched, yet she revealed nothing overtly incriminating. Even the vicar's own nervousness provided a subtle clue. He was careful with his words, measured, yet occasionally revealed contradictions between his statements to the police and the casual remarks he made to neighbours. These were minute, fleeting inconsistencies, but Miss Marple's trained eye and ear did not miss them. By the end of the week, 2 things were clear to Miss Marple. First, the village's inclination toward simplicity, toward assigning blame to the most convenient suspect, was clouding judgment. Second, the true motive, hidden among minor resentments, quiet ambitions and carefully concealed histories, had yet to be illuminated. Patience and careful attention to detail were required. Hasty conclusions, she knew, would serve only to obscure the truth. That evening she returned to the garden, examining the azaleas and the surrounding paths in the fading light. The lace fragment, the positioning of the tea set, and the subtle traces of soil all suggested movement and interaction. Though not a violent struggle, whoever had caused Mrs. Badger's fall had acted subtly, almost invisibly. Miss Marple sat quietly beneath the magnolia tree, her thoughts deliberate. The threads were forming slowly but surely. The obvious suspect could wait. The subtleties, the contradictions, the faint tremors of hidden emotion, that was where the truth lay. And Miss Marple, as always, would be ready to see it. The village, meanwhile, continued its quiet chatter, each person convinced of their own understanding of the tragedy. But Miss Marple, patient and perceptive, knew better. In St. Mary Mead, everyone had a secret, and every secret had its price. Tomorrow she thought she would begin following the patterns more closely, connecting conversations, observing movements, noting reactions. There was a rhythm to human behaviour, a predictable cadence even in its apparent randomness, and it was only a matter of time before the true culprit revealed themselves through it, and Miss Marple, unassuming yet vigilant, would be there to see it. Chapter 5. A Hidden Clue. By the following morning, the village of St. Mary Mead was steeped in uneasy routine. The novelty of shock had faded slightly, replaced by speculation and whispered theories, each more elaborate than the last. Yet beneath the chatter, the subtle undercurrents of suspicion were deepening. The villagers, eager for closure, seemed poised to latch onto any clue, no matter how slight, that might validate their assumptions. Miss Marple, however, did not rush. She understood that the truth seldom reveals itself to those eager to grasp it. Patience, observation, and careful reflection were the tools of discovery, far more reliable than conjecture or insistence. That morning, she visited the scene of the crime once again, strolling along the garden paths with deliberate care. The azaleas bloomed brightly, their scent almost incongruously cheerful, yet Miss Marple's eyes were drawn to small details that had escaped others. A teacup had been knocked askew. A fragment of lace, already under her scrutiny, was draped delicately over a low branch. Everything seemed ordinary, and yet her intuition told her otherwise. It was during this quiet examination that she noticed a subtle indentation in the soft earth near the azaleas. Not a footprint of the gardener, or of any visitor, but a narrow, elongated mark, almost like the edge of a heel pressing into soil. Curious, she bent down, examining the pattern with her usual meticulousness. It suggested movement, a sudden step, perhaps backward in haste, but it was too faint to be accidental. The soil had retained the impression of a precise motion. Miss Marple's mind began to assemble possibilities. The lace fragment, the careful positioning of objects, the faint mark in the soil, these were not random. They suggested deliberate manipulation, a choreography of actions that only someone intimately familiar with Mrs. Badger's routine could have executed. The realization occurred to her gently, like the soft turning of a key in a lock. Someone had engineered the scene to appear accidental. It was subtle, deceptive, and entirely human, just as she had anticipated. Most would look for grand gestures, loud confrontations, or dramatic signs of struggle. But true cunning was quiet, almost invisible, and left only the faintest trace for a discerning observer. Later that day, she paid a visit to Clara, the maid, under the guise of helping organize the household after the funeral arrangements had begun. Clara's nervous energy was palpable. She moved swiftly, but always with a careful, measured grace that suggested she feared even the smallest error might betray her. "Clara, did you notice anything unusual yesterday?" Miss Marple asked gently, pouring herself a cup of tea. Clara hesitated, eyes darting to the floor. Nothing that seemed strange at the time," she whispered. I felt as if something had shifted, but I couldn't say what. Miss Marple nodded, a faint smile at the corner of her lips. Often, the small shifts are the most telling. One does not always recognise their importance immediately. As they spoke, Miss Marple observed a small, subtle mark on Clara's hand, a faint smudge, almost imperceptible. She did not comment, but filed it away in her mind. People carry traces of their actions with them, and these traces, though invisible to casual observers, were revealing to one trained in perception. Meanwhile, gossip continued to swirl outside the household. Mrs. Wilmot, more insistent than ever, declared to anyone who would listen that Finch had clearly acted with malice. Lilian Hawthorne maintained her composure, yet Miss Marple sensed the tension beneath her carefully cultivated poise. Even the vicar, Reverend Peters, seemed slightly distracted, his thoughtful glances betraying a concern that was more personal than he allowed anyone to see. Returning to the garden in the late afternoon, Miss Marple followed a small winding path along the azaleas, revisiting the soil and the lace fragment. Her eyes scanned for inconsistencies, small, subtle indications of movement, of a hand brushing against foliage, of the weight of a person pressing too firmly into the earth. It was then she noticed it, a faint imprint of a ring, pressed delicately into the soil near the base of the azalea bush. The impression was shallow yet unmistakable. A thin band of metal had momentarily contacted the earth in a very particular motion. To any observer, it would have been nothing more than a slight depression in the soil, easily dismissed. To Miss Marple, it was a whisper of intent, a signature of presence. Her mind worked rapidly, connecting threads. The lace fragment, the indentation in the soil, the subtle trace of a ring. These clues suggested someone had been in proximity to Mrs. Badger at the critical moment, had moved carefully to avoid suspicion, and had left behind only the faintest trace of their involvement. Miss Marple considered opportunity as well. The person who had left these clues must have known the garden intimately, understood Mrs. Badger's routine, and anticipated the reactions of those around her. The garden was familiar territory to the household staff and to those closely associated with Mrs. Badger. It was unlikely that an outsider could have executed such a subtle manoeuvre without detection. Later, over tea in her own sitting room, Miss Marple reflected on the significance of her discovery. The lace fragment and soil impressions alone were minor details, seemingly trivial. But in combination with each other, and observed within the broader context of the villagers' movements and behaviours, they were revealing. The truth lay in the quiet interactions, the overlooked moments, and the subtleties that the police and village gossip ignored. Miss Marple realised that the most likely suspects were now narrowed not by overt behaviour, but by opportunity, subtle knowledge of the household, and the faintest hints of concealment. Yet she also knew that the full story would require careful psychological observation. She would need to engage the individuals subtly, watch their reactions, and wait for the critical moment when their own actions betrayed their intentions. By the time evening descended over St. Mary Mead, the village seemed calm once more, though a tense undercurrent persisted. The public was satisfied with preliminary assumptions. The police were content with their obvious suspect. Yet Miss Marple, patient and quietly observant, understood that appearances were deceiving. Somewhere among the familiar faces, the truth waited, hidden in plain sight, delicately shielded by human cunning and social expectation. And Miss Marple, as always, would notice. Chapter 6. Confrontations and Secrets. By the following morning, St. Mary Mead had transformed into a quiet battlefield of subtle accusations and half-formed suspicions. Even the most ordinary routines now carried undercurrents of tension. Shopkeepers whispered behind counters, children spoke in hushed tones, curious yet cautious, and villagers eyed one another with a mixture of pity, suspicion, and fear. The murder of Mrs. Badger had unsettled them far more deeply than any minor scandal ever could. Miss Marple, as always, remained a calm observer. She understood that the truth of human behaviour often emerged not in dramatic displays, but in fleeting glances, hesitant gestures, and inadvertent confessions. Her plan that day was simple. She would visit the more peripheral figures of the village, those whose lives intersected with the household in minor but telling ways. In the quiet of these conversations, she anticipated that the first real cracks in alibis and facades would appear. Her first call was to the housekeeper, Mrs. Bentley, a stern woman who prided herself on maintaining strict order. Mrs. Bentley's grief was outwardly restrained, but Miss Marple immediately noticed her hands were shaking slightly and that she avoided direct eye contact when speaking of the day's events. "Did you notice anything unusual?" Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Bentley hesitated. "Nothing, Miss Marple. Everything was as it should have been. We followed the usual routine, and yet—" Her voice faltered, and she quickly cleared her throat. "I suppose, perhaps, it seemed as though someone had been moving about the garden shortly before." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Moving about? Who, do you think?" "I couldn't say," Mrs. Bentley replied, her eyes flicking nervously to the window. "It was subtle, nothing overt, but I felt, almost sensed, that something was not quite right." A subtle smile touched Miss Marple's lips. Fear, hesitation, and instinct combined often spoke more clearly than words. She made a mental note to watch Mrs. Bentley carefully. Even the most disciplined servant could reveal unintended truths. Next, she visited Lillian Hawthorne, Mrs. Badger's cousin. Lillian's composure was impeccable, her movements precise and measured. Yet Miss Marple observed the faintest tremor in her fingers when she offered Miss Marple tea, and a flicker of tension around her eyes when certain topics arose. "You have been through a difficult time," Miss Marple said softly. "It must be hard to adjust to such sudden loss." "Yes," Lillian replied smoothly. "Dreadful. Absolutely dreadful. But one must carry on, mustn't one? Life continues, even after unfortunate events." Miss Marple nodded, noting her carefully rehearsed language. Repetition of neutral phrases, she reflected, often masked unease or guilt. Lillian's vigilance over her words suggested she was guarding against something, though what remained to be seen. As the morning passed, Miss Marple moved through the village, speaking to neighbours who had casual contact with Mrs. Badger. A pattern began to emerge: minor resentments, long, buried grudges, and past disagreements surfaced when the right questions were asked. Mr. Crompton admitted that he had sometimes felt overlooked by Mrs. Badger in local charitable matters. Reverend Peters confessed, though reluctantly, that a disagreement about church funds had left him embarrassed and somewhat resentful. Even the children offered hints. Emily Barton mentioned a fleeting argument she'd overheard between Mrs. Badger and a neighbour over a trivial matter of etiquette at the party. None of these grievances, individually, seemed sufficient to motivate murder, but Miss Marple knew human behaviour rarely stemmed from a single source. Motive often emerged as a combination of resentment, opportunity and circumstance, woven together in a tapestry of subtle human interactions. It was during her afternoon visits that Miss Marple noticed a telling exchange between Mrs. Wilmot and Lillian Hawthorne. The two women had crossed paths near the village green, and Miss Marple observed a brief but sharp exchange of words. Mrs. Wilmot's eyes flashed with indignation, while Lillian's gaze hardened almost imperceptibly. The conversation was quiet, but the tension was palpable, a fleeting crack in the otherwise composed facade of both women. Miss Marple pondered this carefully. Social facades often concealed simmering rivalries, and rivalries, when coupled with opportunity, could turn fatal. She filed the observation away, adding it to her mental map of human interactions and potential motives. Returning to the Badger estate later that afternoon, Miss Marple met with Clara, the maid. Clara's nervous energy had not abated. She moved quickly, her hands trembling slightly as she arranged flowers and tidied rooms. Miss Marple, seated near the window, asked casually about the day of the garden party. "I kept busy with the tea," Clara replied, glancing toward the azaleas. "I thought I saw someone, or perhaps I imagined it, near the flowers just before it happened. I wasn't certain. I didn't want to say anything wrong." Miss Marple's eyes brightened faintly. The maid's uncertainty, combined with her instinctive observation, suggested that someone had indeed been close to Mrs. Badger shortly before her fall. Someone subtle, careful, and familiar with the household's routines. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her sitting room reflecting on the day's discoveries. The evidence was not yet concrete, but the network of interactions, subtle cues, and hidden resentments formed a discernible pattern. Mrs. Badger's death, far from being an accident, seemed increasingly deliberate, a carefully choreographed act executed by someone intimately aware of the household's rhythms. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the torn lace, the faint soil impressions, and the ring imprint she had noted earlier. Each minor clue, she realized, corresponded to behaviors she had observed among the household staff and close relatives. The careful movements, the rehearsed words, the flickers of tension, all were pieces of a puzzle that, once assembled, would reveal the perpetrator. Yet she understood that revelation would require patience. The suspects were alert, aware that scrutiny had begun. Any misstep could alert them, causing the subtle evidence to vanish like smoke. Miss Marple's task was to continue observing, to engage in quiet psychological testing, and to let human nature itself betray the guilty party. As night fell over St. Mary Mead, the village was quiet but restless. The public maintained its assumptions. The police focused on the obvious, and the household struggled to return to normal. But in the quiet corners, in the subtle gestures, and in the fleeting expressions of unease, Miss Marple had begun to glimpse the shape of truth. Human behaviour, she reflected, was the most revealing of all clues, and in St. Mary Mead, as ever, the truth would emerge, patiently, subtly, and inevitably. Chapter 7. Another Twist. St. Mary Mead was no stranger to whispers, but nothing in recent memory had so unsettled the village as the events surrounding Mrs. Badger's death. The calm of early spring had been shattered, leaving in its place a subtle tension that made even familiar faces seem uncertain, guarded, and potentially dangerous. The morning began quietly, the mist still lingering over the village green, when a sharp cry echoed from the Badger estate. Neighbours rushed to the source of the commotion, finding young Thomas Edgecombe near the garden gates, pale and trembling. His shout drew a crowd, and whispers escalated into urgent murmurs. It's the safe," he stammered. "Someone's broken into Mrs. Badger's study. Papers are everywhere, and the safe is open." Miss Marple, already moving toward the scene, noted the immediate reaction of the villagers: shock, curiosity, and a rush to find blame. Inspector Craddock arrived shortly after, his expression tense, clipboard in hand. "Everyone, step back," he commanded, his tone leaving little room for argument. But his eyes flickered toward Edward Finch, who had arrived with the crowd as though assuming the gardener's involvement was natural. Miss Marple remained composed, her eyes scanning the scene before speaking. The study was in disarray, drawers open, papers scattered across the floor, and the safe door left ajar. Yet there was a peculiar absence of forced entry signs beyond the slightly jostled lock. Whoever had done this was precise, careful, and familiar with the room's contents. "This changes everything," murmured Mrs. Wilmot, pressing closer to the inspector. "Clearly Finch, or someone else, planned this. It cannot be an accident anymore." Miss Marple, however, noted subtleties that contradicted the immediate assumptions. The scattered papers were not torn violently. Nothing appeared stolen. Some documents had been examined, but none removed. The pattern suggested curiosity rather than theft, a search for specific information rather than a hasty or desperate act. "Inspector," she said quietly, "notice how the papers have been arranged after being rifled through. They are not scattered randomly. Someone knew what they were looking for, yet handled the documents cautiously. It is deliberate, but not chaotic." Craddock frowned, adjusting his glasses. "Still, it looks suspicious. Whoever did this had access." Miss Marple observed the reactions of those present. Lillian Hawthorne's hand trembled slightly as she glanced toward the papers. Clara, the maid, looked genuinely frightened, yet there was a careful avoidance of the safe itself. Even Mrs. Wilmot's excitement seemed slightly forced, as though she relished the drama of suspicion rather than the discovery itself. It was the subtlety of human behaviour, as always, that provided Miss Marple with insight. The safe's contents were known to only a few individuals. Anyone casually entering the study would likely mishandle the materials. The careful examination suggested insider knowledge. Meanwhile, a minor, yet telling detail caught Miss Marple's attention. A faint smear of violet powder on the corner of the desk overlooked by all others. It was identical to the cosmetic powder Mrs. Badger was known to use, yet it appeared out of place, as though inadvertently transferred by a visitor unfamiliar with the careful balance of items on the desk. The implications were subtle, but they suggested proximity at a critical moment. The intruder had brushed against the desk while examining the safe, leaving a trace. Miss Marple mentally catalogued this alongside the lace fragment, the soil impression, and the ring imprint she had previously observed. A pattern of deliberate but restrained movements was emerging, pointing to a suspect who was both familiar and cautious. As the day progressed, villagers offered their own theories, each more imaginative than the last. "It's Finch, I'm sure," Mrs. Wilmot whispered to anyone within earshot. "He has the opportunity, the presence of mind, and the audacity." "No," countered Mr. Crompton, shaking his head. "It must be someone who had reasons connected to the household itself, perhaps a family member or one of the staff, not the gardener." Miss Marple, as ever, observed the interplay of human nature. People were eager to assign blame, but their biases, fears and desires often clouded judgment. The truth, she knew, required careful attention to detail and patience. The day ended with a small confrontation between Lillian Hawthorne and Mrs. Beer Wilmot near the village green. Lillian's voice was low but firm. "You're assuming too much, Mrs. Wilmot. Your certainty does not prove anything." Mrs. Wilmot's eyes flashed. "I speak the truth as I see it. Someone is trying to hide their actions, and I will not be deceived." Miss Marple, standing quietly a few paces away, noted the tension and subtle gestures. The way Lillian's fingers tightened on her handbag, the faint flush on Mrs. Wilmot's cheeks, the involuntary narrowing of their eyes. These small signs of emotional strain often revealed far more than words alone. Later, in her sitting room, Miss Marple reviewed the day's events, her mind weaving together the threads of the puzzle. The safe had been examined, but nothing taken. The villagers' attention remained on the most obvious suspects. The subtle traces, smudges, fragments, faint impressions were ignored by all but her, and yet these small details formed the basis of understanding the perpetrator's careful and deliberate actions. She reflected on the combination of clues: the torn lace, the soil imprint, the ring, and now the violet powder. Each pointed to someone intimately familiar with the household, capable of moving carefully without drawing attention, and aware of what to touch and what to avoid. Miss Marple's mind also turned to the psychology of the perpetrator. They must be confident, patient, and accustomed to observation. Fear or panic would have left more obvious marks, yet the subtle clues betrayed the otherwise hidden presence of intention. She sipped her tea thoughtfully, realizing that the new twist, the disturbance of the safe, added layers of complexity. The murder could no longer be examined in isolation. The perpetrator's careful movements in the garden and in the study suggested a pattern. One person, precise and deliberate, navigating both social expectations and physical spaces with caution. Miss Marple's patience, she knew, would soon be rewarded. The subtle inconsistencies, the overlooked traces, and the careful observations would converge, revealing the hidden connections between the events of Easter Sunday and the secret motives lurking beneath the village's placid surface. Outside, the village continued its quiet chatter, unaware that the real story lay not in the loud accusations, but in the faint, almost invisible traces left by a cunning mind. And Miss Marple, as always, watched, noted and waited, knowing that the next revelation would come not from force, but from the subtleties of human behaviour, the very clues that everyone else had missed. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's Final Test. The village of St. Mary Mead had begun to settle into an uneasy rhythm. Life continued in its outwardly ordinary way. The baker rolled dough in the morning, children ran along the village green, and the postman delivered letters with his customary punctuality. Yet beneath the surface, the tension persisted, like a thin line of smoke rising unnoticed. Everyone seemed to be watching everyone else, anticipating the next revelation. Miss Marple, as always, moved quietly within this atmosphere, fully aware of both the spoken words and the silences between them. The recent events, the death of Mrs. Badger and the intrusion into her study, had created a delicate web of suspicion. It was time, Miss Marple decided, to test the reactions of those most closely involved. Subtle engagement, she knew, would reveal what direct questioning could not. Her first engagement was with Lillian Hawthorne. Miss Marple invited her for tea under the pretence of discussing arrangements for the upcoming memorial service. Lillian arrived with her usual composure, though Miss Marple immediately noticed a faint tension in her shoulders and the slight quiver in her voice when she greeted her hostess. "You must be very tired after these last few days," Miss Marple began gently. "The household seems unsettled, I imagine." Yes, "It has been trying," Lillian replied, offering a polite, measured smile. "One never expects such a thing to happen in a quiet village." Miss Marple poured tea and settled into her chair. "It is often the quiet villages that conceal the most," she remarked lightly. "Everyone knows everyone, yet people guard their thoughts and actions carefully. One would be surprised what even the most discreet individuals might attempt under the right circumstances." Lillian's eyes flickered, almost imperceptibly. She sipped her tea, her fingers curling tightly around the handle. Miss Marple noted this without comment. The reaction, however subtle, was exactly what she intended to observe. It suggested that the words had struck a chord, prompting an involuntary display of discomfort or recognition. Next, she invited Clara, the maid, to assist with organising the household's papers. Clara's nervous energy was immediately apparent. She moved quickly but deliberately, her hands trembling slightly as she handled the documents. Miss Marple spoke of the garden, of the tea set and the flowers, her tone casual yet pointed. "Clara, I noticed the azaleas are particularly lovely this year," she said. "It must have been difficult to maintain them while everyone was attending to other matters." Clara glanced at her, eyes wide, as though unsure whether to respond. I tried my best, Miss Marple," she said softly. "Everything was as she liked it." Miss Marple nodded, observing the slight hesitation in Clara's speech. "It's often the small details, the things we consider trivial, that reveal more than we imagine. Even a careless gesture or a fleeting glance can carry meaning." Clara's fingers brushed against the lace fragment Miss Marple had kept, and her eyes widened for a brief moment before she quickly composed herself. Miss Marple noted it quietly, an instinctive reaction, small yet telling. Later that afternoon she arranged to see Edward Finch, the gardener. She wandered with him through the perimeter of the estate, commenting on the paths, the flower beds, and the subtle beauty of early spring. "Edward, you have been very helpful," she said gently. "Yet even the most attentive among us can overlook small things. Sometimes it is not what one does, but what one misses that can alter events profoundly." Finch frowned slightly, but his posture remained relaxed. He answered carefully, yet Miss Marple detected no signs of guilt in the subtle shifts of his body. His composure seemed genuine, untainted by duplicity. Throughout the day, Miss Marple carefully observed interactions, noting which reactions were instinctive and which seemed controlled. She asked indirect questions, commented casually on minor inconsistencies, and watched for responses that betrayed the slightest unease. Human behaviour, she knew, rarely lies. Words can be rehearsed, gestures can be measured, but instinctive reactions, the brief tightening of a hand, the flicker of an eye, a tremor in the voice, cannot be faked for long. By evening, she convened a quiet gathering of the closest villagers in her sitting room, under the guise of discussing arrangements for Mrs. Badger's memorial. The conversation flowed naturally at first, reminiscences, gentle condolences, and polite inquiries. Then Miss Marple introduced a subtle psychological test. She spoke of the garden, the tea gathering, and the events leading to Mrs. Badger's death. Her voice was calm, casual, yet her words hinted at knowledge only the perpetrator or someone very close could recognise. "It is such a pity, of course," she said lightly. "The azaleas were disturbed, though not in a manner one might immediately notice. The small details are the most revealing, don't you agree?" There was a slight pause. Clara's hands twitched as she adjusted her dress. Lillian's fingers gripped her teacup tightly. Edward Finch, as ever, remained composed. The subtle reactions, though quiet, were telling. Miss Marple catalogued them meticulously. She spoke further, introducing the idea of a subtle disturbance in the study. Papers rifled through, the safe left open. "One might assume theft or a hasty search," she said gently. "Yet the arrangement suggests familiarity, confidence, and deliberate care. Someone who knew exactly what to look for, and how to avoid detection." A faint blush coloured Lillian Hawthorne's cheeks. Her eyes flicked toward Miss Marple, then downward. Clara swallowed audibly, glancing at the floor. Finch remained neutral, as though unaffected by the words. Miss Marple allowed the moment to linger. The small cues, slight tremors, fleeting expressions and minute gestures were more revealing than any confession. She observed silently, letting human nature reveal what pretense could not. By the end of the gathering, Miss Marple had gathered a wealth of information. Lillian Hawthorne exhibited controlled tension and fleeting discomfort. Clara, though fearful, displayed instinctive reactions suggestive of knowledge of the garden and safe incident. Edward Finch showed genuine composure, consistent with truthfulness. Mrs. Wilmot continued to project her assumptions loudly, serving more as a mirror for village speculation than a source of evidence. Miss Marple retired that evening satisfied. The first layer of testing was complete. Human instinct had provided small but powerful signals, subtly confirming patterns that she had observed over the preceding days. The puzzle was now narrowing, and she could sense that the next revelation, the one that would bring all threads together, was approaching. She reflected on the delicate nature of her task. Direct questioning often invites deception, but indirect engagement and careful observation reveal truths naturally. A single, unguarded reaction could betray the guilty, especially when coupled with subtle psychological nudges. As she prepared for the following day, Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself. The village was still unaware of the intricate connections she had discerned. The murderer, confident in their knowledge of appearances, had underestimated the quiet, unassuming observer who noticed the smallest inconsistencies. By morning, Miss Marple would be ready to follow the final threads, patterns of movement, moments of hesitation, and tiny behavioural clues to bring the truth into full view. And when the revelation came, it would be gentle, precise, and inevitable, as human nature revealed what pretense could not conceal. Chapter 9. The Reveal. The village of St. Mary Mead had awoken to a brisk, clear morning, the sun glinting over the rooftops and glimmering on the dew-covered gardens. Yet beneath the cheerful appearance, a tension lingered, as though the events of the past week had left a lingering unease. Villagers moved about their routines with careful deliberation, each glance and gesture carrying a faint weight of suspicion. Miss Marple, as always, rose early, her mind alert and focused. The psychological tests of the previous day had yielded a wealth of insight. Reactions, subtle gestures, and the instinctive movements of those closest to the household had begun to form a coherent pattern. Today she decided the final threads would be drawn together. She invited the key figures, Lillian Hawthorne, Clara the maid, and Mrs. Wilmot, to her sitting room under the pretence of discussing arrangements for Mrs. Badger's memorial. Edward Finch was also present, though he remained quietly observant as ever. The gathering appeared casual, almost routine, but Miss Marple's mind was already piecing together the clues in preparation for the revelation. "Thank you all for coming," she began gently, pouring tea with her usual calm. "It is such a difficult time, and yet we must remember the importance of small details. Often what seems insignificant at first reveals the whole truth in due course." She allowed the words to settle, watching the reactions. Lillian Hawthorne shifted slightly in her chair, a fleeting frown crossing her composed face. Clara adjusted her hands nervously on her lap, her eyes darting toward the lace fragment Miss Marple had placed subtly on the table. Mrs. Wilmot leaned forward eagerly, as though anticipating scandal. Finch observed silently, his posture steady and measured. Miss Marple continued, her voice soft yet deliberate. "Let us recall the events of Easter Sunday. The garden, the tea, the moment when tragedy struck. A slip, some say. But if we look more closely—" She gestured lightly to the lace fragment and the soil imprint she had collected earlier. "We see evidence that suggests intention rather than accident." Clara's fingers twitched, and Lillian's eyes widened briefly. Mrs. Wilmot leaned closer, curiosity and excitement overtaking her usual prudence. Finch's expression remained unchanged. "The lace fragment," Miss Marple said, picking it up delicately, "was torn during a struggle, though a struggle so subtle that most would not notice. The soil imprint, the ring mark, and the faint traces of violet powder in Mrs. Badger's study." She let each item speak for itself in the silent pauses that followed. "All indicate someone familiar with the household, someone aware of the routine, and someone careful to avoid detection." She leaned back slightly, letting her gaze sweep across the room. "Now, consider the psychological evidence. Lillian Hawthorne, your composure faltered at subtle references to the garden and study. Clara, your instincts betrayed a fleeting recognition when the lace fragment was near. Finch's reactions, however, were measured and consistent with truthfulness." A hush settled over the room. Mrs. Wilmot's eager expression froze, and Lillian's posture stiffened, her hands clasped tightly. Clara's gaze flickered to Miss Marple, uncertain. Miss Marple's voice was calm, almost conversational, yet carried a precision that could not be ignored. The evidence, both physical and behavioural, points to someone who orchestrated the scene with care. They knew what to touch, what to move, and how to leave only the faintest traces. They calculated every step, believing their actions invisible to the casual observer. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. Lillian shifted in her seat, her fingers tightening on her teacup. "Consider also the motive," Miss Marple continued. Mrs. Badger, though outwardly amiable, had influence over household affairs and the social dynamics of St. Mary Mead. Disputes, however minor, could build over time. Jealousies, rivalries, and personal frustrations accumulate, often unnoticed until they reach a tipping point. Her gaze settled firmly on Lillian Hawthorne. "Lillian, you felt overshadowed, overlooked, or perhaps constrained by Mrs. Badger's decisions. It was not a sudden rage, but a carefully considered act, executed with the intent to appear accidental." Lillian's face paled, a faint tremor in her hands betraying her otherwise composed demeanour. I don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her tone gentle but unyielding. "The torn lace matches the dress you wore that day. The ring imprint in the soil corresponds to the hand you habitually wear your wedding band upon, and the faint violet powder in the study, transferred from your gloves or hand, places you at the scene, examining the safe. You believed you could avoid detection, but human nature has a way of revealing itself in the smallest gestures, the most instinctive reactions." Lillian's lips trembled. She glanced toward Clara, whose eyes widened, the realization dawning slowly. I only meant," Lillian stammered, her composure crumbling. "The intent, the careful orchestration, the subtle manipulations. All point to you," Miss Marple said softly. "It was not a crime of passion, but of planning. You sought to conceal resentment beneath a veneer of politeness, to let the fall appear accidental. Yet the small, overlooked details, the lace, the soil, the ring, and the powder, tell the story that pretense cannot hide." A faint sob escaped Clara, not from guilt, but from the shock of recognition. Finch's expression remained calm, unshaken by the revelation. Mrs. Wilmot blinked rapidly, caught between vindication and disbelief, her previous certainty now dissolved. Miss Marple continued, her words measured. "The safe was examined, but nothing taken. That was a deliberate choice, designed to create misdirection. You intended to manipulate perceptions to make the incident seem random, when it was in fact carefully orchestrated, yet your careful control betrayed you in the smallest details." Lillian Hawthorne, finally realizing the inevitability of exposure, sank back into her chair, defeated. Her hands fell limply, her eyes downcast. "It was not supposed to. I only wanted to teach her a lesson," she murmured. Miss Marple nodded gently. "A lesson, perhaps, but one with irreversible consequences. The truth, as it often does, emerges despite our best efforts to conceal it. In the end, human nature and careful observation reveal what pretense cannot hide." The room was silent, save for the soft clinking of teacups and the occasional breath of astonished villagers. The subtle, invisible thread of evidence had been drawn taut, revealing the full picture in its delicate but unmistakable pattern. Inspector Craddock entered, having been summoned quietly by Miss Marple. He observed Lillian's demeanour, the subtle evidence, and the assembled clues. Nodding to Miss Marple, he said quietly, "I suppose that makes sense. She had opportunity, motive, and means. Well observed, Miss Marple." Miss Marple merely smiled, her eyes calm and reflective. The truth is often revealed not by force or confession, but by the careful observation of the small things, the things people think unnoticed. Human nature, Inspector, is the most revealing of all evidence. Lillian Hawthorne was taken into custody shortly thereafter, her demeanour subdued and resigned. The village, though shocked, slowly began to accept the revelation, the unsettling tension gradually dissipating into a cautious normality. Miss Marple, seated by her window that evening, reflected on the events that had unfolded. The subtle interplay of observation, human behaviour, and seemingly trivial details had revealed the truth long before any direct evidence could be produced. In St. Mary Mead, as always, the quiet, unassuming detective had unravelled the complex tapestry of motives and actions, bringing clarity to a situation clouded by appearances and assumptions. And though the village would soon return to its ordinary rhythms, Miss Marple knew that beneath every polite smile, every quiet gesture, and every small action, the intricate patterns of human nature continued, waiting to reveal themselves to the patient, perceptive observer. Chapter 10. Aftermath. The village of St. Mary Mead had returned to its quiet rhythms, though with an air of subdued reflection lingering like a gentle shadow. The azaleas in the Badger Garden bloomed once more, their bright colours a reminder that life continues, even after tragedy and revelation. The streets were alive with familiar sights, the baker arranging his morning loaves, children skipping along the cobbled paths, and the postman delivering letters with the punctuality that had always been a mark of comfort in the village. Yet, beneath the ordinary, there remained a subtle awareness. The past week had changed the village, and its people were now attuned to the delicate layers of human behaviour that often go unnoticed. Gossip had settled into polite discussion, and the villagers were careful with their words, mindful that actions and expressions might carry more meaning than they realised. Miss Marple, ever the quiet observer, had returned to her usual routine. She spent the early morning hours in her sitting room, sipping tea and watching the soft lights spill across the garden. The house was calm, and for the first time in several days, she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The case, though resolved, had offered her the usual mixture of insight and reflection. The subtlety of human behaviour, the hidden resentments, and the intricate interplay of social dynamics had revealed the truth long before any overt confession could be obtained. Lillian Hawthorne had been arrested, her carefully maintained composure finally giving way under the gentle pressure of observation and psychological insight. Visitors came and went, paying respects, offering condolences, and discussing arrangements for Mrs. Badger's memorial. Each interaction provided Miss Marple with small reminders of the patterns she had observed, the faint flickers of hesitation, the minute shifts in posture, and the fleeting glances that betray hidden thought. In St. Mary Mead, as in any community, the outward appearance of calm often masked complex networks of human emotion and intention. Inspector Craddock paid a visit that afternoon. He arrived with his usual courteous briskness, though there was a softer, more contemplative look in his eyes than when he'd been focused solely on the investigation. "Miss Marple," he said, removing his hat politely, "I must admit your observations were invaluable. I had the facts, the witness statements, and the physical evidence, yet it was the subtle psychological insights that brought the pieces together. I should have realised earlier that human behaviour, carefully observed, often outweighs tangible proof." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Inspector, the truth is rarely loud. People reveal themselves in whispers, in gestures, in the smallest details. It is only by watching patiently and listening carefully that one discerns the patterns that others overlook." Craddock nodded thoughtfully, his respect for the unassuming detective evident. "St. Mary Mead owes you more than gratitude, I think." Miss Marple, ever modest, inclined her head. "It is enough to see justice done, and for the village to return to its ordinary course." Outside, the village resumed its rhythm, though with an undercurrent of caution. Mrs. Wilmot continued her habitual rounds, though her gossip was now tempered by the knowledge that misjudgments could carry consequences. The baker's wife, the children, and other residents moved through their daily tasks with renewed awareness, their interactions subtly influenced by the events that had unfolded. The memorial for Mrs. Badger was conducted with quiet dignity. Lillian Hawthorne was absent, escorted by officers, yet the villagers carried out the ceremony with respect, acknowledging both the deceased and the lessons learned from the tragedy. Miss Marple attended quietly, noting the restrained grief, the polite whispers, and the subtle gestures that communicated more than words ever could. Later, Miss Marple returned to her sitting room, where she sat by the window and watched the garden bathe in the soft glow of the late afternoon sun. The azaleas swayed gently in the breeze, and the scent of early spring filled the air. She reflected on the sequence of events, considering how the small, overlooked details, the torn lace, the soil imprint, the ring, the violet powder, had illuminated the truth. Each clue had been minor in isolation, yet in combination, They formed a mosaic that revealed the careful orchestration behind Mrs. Badger's death. Human nature, Miss Marple mused, was as intricate and delicate as the petals of the azaleas before her. Resentments, ambitions, and hidden intentions often lie dormant beneath the surface of everyday life, only emerging under pressure or opportunity. And yet, as she had observed, the smallest gestures, the faintest inconsistencies, and the subtlest reactions could betray intentions that the most meticulous planning might try to conceal. Her thoughts turned briefly to Lillian Hawthorne. It was not malice in its most violent form that had driven the crime, but a combination of jealousy, pride, and the desire to control appearances. Miss Marple considered the delicate balance between intention and consequence, the way small actions ripple outward, influencing others and leaving traces that reveal truths even the guilty cannot entirely hide. As evening descended, the village lights flickered on, casting soft glows across familiar streets. Miss Marple remained at her window, her gaze sweeping over St. Mary Mead. Life had resumed, but she knew that beneath the ordinary, the intricate patterns of human behaviour continued, waiting to be observed, understood, and when necessary, gently unravelled. The case was resolved, but the lessons endured. Patience, observation, an understanding of human nature had revealed the truth where hasty assumptions and superficial evidence might have failed. And in that quiet, deliberate manner, Miss Marple reflected once more on the subtle, enduring complexity of the people around her. Finally she settled into her favourite chair, a cup of tea warming her hands, and allowed herself a rare moment of quiet satisfaction. The village was at peace, the truth revealed, and human nature, in all its intricate subtlety, had once again shown itself to the patient observer. In St. Mary Mead, life would continue, bright, ordinary and quietly intricate, as it always had and always would. Miss Marple's eyes softened as she gazed at the familiar garden paths, the blooming flowers, and the distant chimneys of the village rooftops. She smiled faintly to herself, knowing that while mysteries would always arise, the combination of patience, observation, and understanding of human nature would always illuminate the truth, no matter how subtle or well concealed. And with that, she rose, prepared to take her evening walk, knowing that tomorrow the village would awaken once again to the ordinary rhythms of life, its secrets quietly observed, its stories gently understood, and its lessons quietly learned.